Have you ever walked through the woods at night and felt like someone or something was watching you? Imagine a soft shimmer of light flickering between the trees. At first, you think it's just a firefly, but then wings glisten in the dark, delicate as silver dust. A tiny figure dances in the air, glowing with a magic beyond this world. Could it be a fairy? For thousands of years, across every culture and every land, people have whispered stories of flying fairies, guardians of nature, playful tricksters, and mysterious beings who hover between our world and the unknown. Tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, we'll travel through their myths, their mischief, and their magic, discovering why these winged spirits continue to capture the human imagination. Close your eyes for a moment and let your imagination wander. You are standing at the edge of a quiet forest, the kind where every sound feels alive, where every breeze seems to whisper a secret. The day has just given way to twilight, and the last golden rays of the sun melt into the soft blue of evening. The world feels hushed, as though holding its breath. And then something flickers. At first, you think it might be a firefly, but this light doesn't blink on and off. Instead, it glides smoothly, like a lantern floating through the trees. You take a step closer, your heart beating with curiosity. The glow shimmers brighter, and then you see it, delicate wings, like silver lace, catching the fading light. A tiny figure, no taller than your hand, drifts gracefully through the air. Its wings hum softly, its eyes sparkle with curiosity, and its presence feels both strange and familiar. Could it be a fairy? For centuries, countless people have asked the same question. Across the world, in villages, mountains, deserts, and islands, stories have been told of small, glowing beings that dance in the night sky. Sometimes they are described as protectors of nature, gentle guardians of rivers, forests, and flowers. At other times, they are mischievous tricksters who love to play pranks on unsuspecting humans. Yet in every version, one detail remains the same. They can fly, and their flight carries with it a sense of wonder that stirs the imagination. Think of it. In the stillness of night, before electricity and city lights, people would gather around fires or rest under the stars. When the wind rustled the leaves, or when strange lights moved in the distance, the human mind reached for stories. Could those mysterious lights be spirits? Could they be guardians? Could they be fairies, creatures from another world, brushing past ours in secret? The beauty of these tales lies not only in the fairies themselves, but in what they reveal about us. Humans have always searched for magic, for a sign that the world is bigger than it seems. When crops grew well, some thanked the fairies. When milk soured, others blamed their tricks. In moments of awe or confusion, the stories of flying fairies gave meaning, mystery, and even comfort. And fairies were not limited to one land or one culture. In Ireland, they were called the Sidhe, mysterious people of the hills, moving like the wind and shimmering with light. In Greece, nymphs were said to dance in groves and rivers, unseen except by those lucky or unlucky enough to stumble upon them. In Persia, the Peris were delicate spirits of light, often imagined with gossamer wings, helping guide humans toward goodness. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, the details shift but the feeling remains the same. Small, winged beings who remind us that nature is alive, that the unseen world is always closer than we think. Now, imagine standing once again in that twilight forest. The fairy hovers before you, wings glistening like dew. It doesn't speak, yet you feel as if it understands you completely. For a fleeting moment, time slows down. The ordinary world, the path, the trees, even the ground beneath your feet, seems to fade, and all that exists is the glowing figure drifting in the air. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanishes, leaving only a trail of light, like dust hanging in the breeze. You blink, unsure if it was real. Was it only your imagination? Or did you just step into the same mystery that people have whispered about for thousands of years? This is where our story begins, not in books or screens, but in the wonder of human imagination, the place where magic has always lived. And tonight, as you relax and listen, we will explore the long journey of flying fairies, from the oldest legends carved in stone to the bedtime stories that soothe children to sleep, and even to the modern moments when people claim they've seen a flicker of wings out of the corner of their eye. So settle in, let your thoughts drift like wings in the evening air, and allow yourself to believe, just for tonight, that the world is full of unseen wonders, that fairies do exist, and that somewhere, out there in the shadows of history and myth, they are still flying. When we step back into the ancient world, long before movies and fairy tale picture books, we find that the idea of magical, flying beings was already deeply rooted in human imagination. Every culture, in its own way, painted a picture of small, luminous figures that soared through the skies or drifted gracefully across the land. And while their names and forms varied, their wings and their mystery were almost always the same. One of the most famous traditions of fairy belief begins in the rolling green hills of Ireland. Here, the people spoke of the Sidhe, pronounced she, mysterious beings connected to the land itself. They were said to live in hollow hills or beneath ancient mounds, places that even today are called fairy forts. The Sidhe were not always tiny, like the fairies we imagine today. Sometimes they appeared tall, beautiful, and radiant, glowing with an inner light. At other times, they seemed as small as butterflies, darting through the dusk. Whether grand or tiny, one detail remained. They were not bound to the ground. They could vanish into the air, drift across landscapes, and soar with the wind, free in a way that humans could only dream of. Moving further east, into ancient Greece, we find the stories of nymphs. These were spirits of nature, each one tied to a particular part of the natural world. There were water nymphs who lived in streams and lakes, mountain nymphs who danced on cliffs, and tree nymphs who whispered through the leaves. Unlike the fairies of Ireland, nymphs were usually imagined as human-sized, yet they shared the same sense of lightness and freedom. Their movements were described as graceful, almost floating, as though they were carried by invisible wings. To see one was to catch a glimpse of nature itself come alive. Greek poets and philosophers often wrote about these beings, describing their beauty as so dazzling that mortals could hardly bear to look at them. And though they weren't always winged, the way they glided through forests and springs gave them the aura of flight. Meanwhile, in the heart of Persia and across the Middle East, Another kind of fairy-like being appeared in ancient stories. They were called the Peris, delicate, winged spirits of light. Unlike darker creatures of folklore, Peris were believed to be benevolent, bringing blessings and guiding humans toward goodness. Persian art often showed them with soft, feathery wings, hovering in the skies like birds of paradise. They symbolized purity and hope, and their flight was said to carry messages from the heavens. Even today, in Persian poetry, the image of a peri is a symbol of beauty beyond human reach. If we travel further still, to India, we find that Hindu traditions are filled with celestial beings who glide through the air. While not always called fairies, many were described with wings, radiant bodies, and the ability to fly across both heaven and earth. Some were guardians, some were tricksters, but all carried that same sense of mystery that we find in fairy stories everywhere. Across the world, the details change, but the pattern remains. People, separated by oceans and centuries, all told stories of beings who could defy gravity, who shimmered with light, and who seemed to dance between this world and another. Maybe this is because flight itself has always symbolized freedom. Long before humans invented wings of wood or machines of steel, they dreamed of soaring. And what better way to capture that longing than to imagine small, magical beings who could do what we could not? To ancient people, the skies were not empty. They were alive with mystery. Every shooting star, every strange light, every rustle in the trees could be explained by the presence of these fairies. And though their names differed, Sidhi, nymphs, Peris, the heart of the story was always the same. Somewhere, just beyond our reach, lives a race of beings who can fly. And so, through the myths of Ireland, Greece, Persia, and beyond, the foundation of fairy belief was built. A foundation that, centuries later, would grow into the mischievous, glittering fairies we think of today. But here, in the ancient world, they were more than just bedtime stories. They were symbols of the human connection to nature, the sky, and the mysteries that lie between earth and heaven. When most people hear the word fairy, they think of something gentle, glowing, and kind. But the truth is, fairy stories have always carried two sides: light and shadow, kindness and mischief. In fact, in many traditions, fairies are less like guardian angels and more like unpredictable neighbors. They could help you if they wished, but just as easily they could play tricks, leaving you confused, unsettled, or even frightened. In the old villages of Europe, fairies were believed to live very close to human life. Farmers, shepherds, and travelers treated them with respect because one never knew when a fairy might be watching. It became a custom in many households to leave out small gifts, such as bowls of cream or pieces of bread, as offerings. If you remembered, the fairies might bless your home. But if you forgot, that's when trouble began. People claimed that neglecting the fairies could lead to spoiled milk, tangled hair, or restless nights filled with strange dreams. The English countryside was especially full of fairy folklore. Here, the fairies often appeared as pixies, tiny tricksters with wings like dragonflies. Pixies loved to laugh, to confuse travelers, and to lead people astray in the woods. Many villagers told stories of wandering at night, only to realize they had been walking in circles for hours, guided by fairy mischief. To protect themselves, some would turn their clothing inside out, believing it would break the fairy spell. And then there were the fairy rings, perfect circles of mushrooms or grass that seemed to appear overnight. Science tells us these rings are caused by natural growth patterns of fungi. But long ago, people believed they were the footprints of fairy dances. To step inside a fairy ring was considered dangerous. You might be pulled into the fairy realm, trapped for what felt like a few minutes, only to return and discover that years had passed in the human world. Some warned that stepping into a ring could also curse your health, leaving you weak or dazed. Either way, the fairy ring stood as a reminder that the land belonged not just to humans, but to forces unseen. In Scotland, the legends grew even deeper, with fairies divided into two great groups, the Seelie Court and the Unseelie Court. The Seelie were the fairies of light, generally kind, though still easily offended. They might bless your harvest or guide a lost traveler, but only if shown respect. The Unseelie, however, were feared. They were wild, dark, and hostile, sweeping across the countryside in groups, causing harm wherever they passed. If a human crossed their path, there was little hope for safety. These stories taught people not only about fairies, but about the balance of life, light and dark, kindness and cruelty, blessings and curses. Even outside of Europe, fairy-like spirits carried this same dual nature. In Japan, for instance, the small-winged spirits known as yosei were believed to sometimes help humans, but also to mislead them with illusions. In West African folklore, trickster spirits appear in forms that echo fairy mischief, teaching lessons through confusion and chaos. Everywhere we look, the idea repeats: small, magical beings who delight in reminding humans that we are not in full control of the world. Why were fairies so often described as tricksters? Perhaps because they reflect our own relationship with nature. Just as a good harvest could bring joy, a sudden storm could bring ruin. Just as a peaceful walk could bring calm, a sudden fall into a ditch could cause pain. Nature is beautiful but unpredictable, kind but also wild. In this way, fairies were the personification of nature itself, playful, mysterious, and sometimes dangerous. And so, stories of fairy mischief have lasted for centuries. They remind us that magic is not always gentle, and that even the smallest beings can shape the fate of humans. To live alongside fairies was to live with humility, to accept that not everything could be controlled. Tonight, as you listen, think of those fairy rings hidden in fields, those tiny laughs drifting through the trees. Imagine a light flickering just out of reach, playful and teasing, daring you to chase it. That is the world of fairy mischief, a reminder that magic, like life, is always full of surprises. As time passed and human societies changed, fairy stories did not fade away. Instead, they transformed, finding new life in art, literature, and imagination. The mischievous forest spirits of old legends became muses for poets, painters, and playwrights. From the candlelit stages of Elizabethan theater to the delicate brushstrokes of Victorian painters, fairies fluttered their way into the cultural imagination, leaving behind some of the most enchanting images in history. Let's begin in the Middle Ages, a time when the world was filled with knights, castles, and quests. During this era, fairies often appeared in romantic tales and epic poetry. They were mysterious figures who tested heroes, offered magical gifts, or pulled mortals into enchanted realms. Some medieval writers described fairy queens who ruled entire kingdoms hidden beneath the hills. Others spoke of fairy lovers, whose beauty was so captivating that mortals risked everything to be with them. These early stories gave fairies a place in the grand dramas of human life: love, honor, temptation, and destiny. Then came the age of Shakespeare, whose work gave fairies a lasting place in theater and storytelling. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the fairy queen Titania and her mischievous followers fill the stage with moonlit magic. Shakespeare's fairies were not frightening creatures of the dark, but playful, charming, and full of humor. They became symbols of wonder, adding sparkle to the tangled romances of the play. For many, this was their first introduction to fairies not as dangerous beings, but as delightful companions to human imagination. As centuries rolled on, the Victorian era brought a fairy revival unlike any other. In the 1800s, artists and writers became fascinated by the idea of small, winged beings living secretly among flowers and forests. Painters created detailed fairy scenes, with delicate figures perched on mushrooms or hovering over meadows. These artworks often shimmered with light and color, creating a dreamlike vision of a magical world just beyond our reach. Fairies in this period were not mischievous tricksters, but innocent, beautiful, and almost childlike. They became associated with purity and wonder, reflecting the Victorian love for nature and imagination. It was also in this period that fairies began to appear strongly in children's literature. Writers realized that fairies could capture the imagination of young readers, offering them stories filled with adventure, magic, and hope. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fairies had become a staple of fairy tales, nursery rhymes, and bedtime stories. They were no longer only mysterious beings of folklore, but companions to childhood itself. Perhaps the most famous modern fairy of all emerged in the early 1900s, Tinker Bell, from J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. With her sparkling wings and trail of pixie dust, Tinker Bell became an icon of flight, freedom, and playful spirit. She was sometimes jealous, sometimes bold, but always magical. Disney later reimagined her with a green dress and glowing wings, securing her place as the fairy most recognized around the world. But the story doesn't end with books and paintings. Fairies continued to spread their wings into film, television, and even music. Animated films brought them to life with dazzling color, while modern fantasy novels expanded their mythology into complex worlds of fairy kingdoms and hidden realms. Even today, festivals and artworks celebrate fairies, often blending the ancient traditions with modern creativity. Why did fairies endure so strongly in art and imagination? Perhaps because they speak to something timeless within us, the longing for beauty, for freedom, and for mystery. Fairies are a reminder that even in a world of science and technology, there is still room for wonder. They are a symbol of imagination itself, whispering that the world holds more than what we can see. So, when we look at a painting of a fairy or read a story about a fairy queen, we are not just enjoying art. We are touching something older something shared across centuries, the human desire to believe in magic. And in this way, fairies, once born in the shadows of folklore, continue to live, glowing brightly in the art and imagination of every age. After wandering through centuries of myths, legends, and art, a question remains. Do fairies still fly among us today? Were they only creations of folklore, or could something of their presence still linger in the world around us? In many parts of the world, belief in fairies has never truly disappeared. In Ireland, for example, there are still places where people tread carefully around ancient mounds and stone circles. These sites are said to be the homes of the fairies, and even in modern times, roads have been rerouted so as not to disturb them. Farmers have been known to avoid cutting down certain trees, especially lone hawthorn trees, because tradition says fairies rest beneath their branches. To interfere with a fairy tree, the old stories warn, is to invite misfortune. Whether out of respect for heritage or a deeper sense of mystery, people still honor these traditions today. In Iceland, belief in the hidden folk is so strong that it shapes the way communities live with the land. Before construction projects, locals sometimes call in consultants who specialize in identifying areas that should be left untouched, places where fairies or hidden people are thought to dwell. While outsiders may smile at the idea, many Icelanders treat it with seriousness, blending modern life with ancient belief in a way that feels natural and protective of the environment. But it's not only in Europe. Around the world, people continue to share stories of strange lights, mysterious voices, or fleeting figures that feel otherworldly. In forests in the United States, travelers sometimes describe seeing orbs of light moving gracefully through the trees. In rural Japan, small glowing spirits known as yosei are still mentioned in children's tales. In South America, stories of tiny winged beings, similar to fairies, are whispered around campfires. The details may change, but the theme repeats: small, magical beings who hover on the edges of our vision. Skeptics, of course, argue that these stories are only imagination. They say that fairies are symbols, representations of our longing for freedom, our respect for nature, or our fear of the unknown. Psychologists suggest that belief in fairies helped ancient people explain the unexplainable: a sudden illness, a missing item, or a strange sound in the night. And yet, even with science explaining so much of our world, fairy stories continue to endure. Why? Maybe because fairies represent more than just folklore. They represent the human need for wonder. In a world that often feels predictable, fairies remind us that mystery still exists. They invite us to see nature not as something ordinary, but as something alive, magical, and full of surprises. They also remind us of childhood, the time when we believed in magic without hesitation, when a glimmer of light in the dark could mean a fairy was near. And perhaps, just perhaps, there are still fairies out there. Perhaps they are not as tiny, winged beings hiding under mushrooms, but as energies, forces, or spirits of nature that we cannot yet explain. Some who have walked alone at dusk swear they have felt a presence beside them. Others describe dreams so vivid, with fairies guiding them through forests, that they wake unsure if it was truly just a dream. In the end, whether real or imagined, fairies still matter. They matter because they give us permission to pause, to wonder, and to listen. They remind us that the world is not just made of facts and numbers, but of stories, feelings, and mysteries. To believe in fairies, even for just a moment, is to believe that the universe still has secrets waiting to be discovered. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, let yourself picture them one last time. Imagine the gentle flutter of wings in the distance, a soft laugh carried on the wind, or a sparkle of light fading into the trees. Whether they live in history, in myth, or perhaps still in the hidden corners of our world, fairies continue to fly, in stories, in dreams, and in the endless imagination of those who dare to believe. Thank you for joining me on this magical journey. If you enjoyed this story, please tap like and subscribe so you'll never miss the next bedtime adventure. Sweet dreams, and may fairies always fly in your imagination.